Hello everyone, and welcome to Wicked Encounters, where we explore just what goes bump in the night. I'm your host, Allie, and before we begin, I'd like to give a big thanks to Coots for helping us stick to our weekly upload. I was sick as heck last week, but I'm back, baby! And today, we're cracking open the case files for what is commonly referred to as Russia's biggest mystery, the Dyatlov Pass incident. The Dyatlov Pass incident occurred in February 1959, when 9 young skiers went on an adventurous hiking trip in Russia's Ural Mountains. Now, it's not odd for a group to end up going missing on an adventure, especially when it comes to mountains. But the details and evidence discovered at the Dyatlov Pass, well, it's very unusual to say the least. And because of that, it has raised different strange theories on what could have happened to the skiers, ranging from an avalanche to American spies, aliens, yetis, KGB cover-up, secret weapon testing, and insane weather. It's genuinely such a hard story to even try to wrap your mind around what could have happened. So let's get started with the facts and what we do know about what had happened. The group was made up entirely of experienced skiers, led by a 5th-year engineering student at Ural Polytechnic Institute, Igor Dyatlov. Igor was deemed the most experienced member of the Explorers Club at the Institute, where he had led a number of wilderness trips using equipment he had invented or improved on. The group in total initially consisted of 10 individuals, whose plan was to cover over 190 miles in 16 days across a route through the Ural Mountains in Siberia, where, as far as anyone knew, had never been taken before. It seemed an easy enough route, as the mountains were fairly gentle with rounded tops. The challenge wasn't going to be in the terrain, but the cold temperatures, deep snow, and high winds. The expedition would exemplify the boldness and vigor of the Soviet generation after the success of Sputnik, and Igor's proposal was approved by the UPI Sports Club. Each member of the group was an experienced cross-country skier and winter camper. Hell, one of them, the youngest at 20, Lyuda Dibanina, had been accidentally shot by one of the hunters in her last exploration and survived a 50-mile journey back to civilization, where she felt bad about having made the others worry so. The group made a few stops along their journey to various villages, but at the last one, the village of Vijay, one of the explorers, Yuri, dropped out of the trip since he was feeling sick, an act that would ultimately save his life. The group's plan was to return to the village around February 12th, and from there, telegram the UPI Sports Club to let them know they made it safely. That telegram never came. Initially, the sports club believed that the group had simply been delayed. It was common for there to be hiccups during a journey such as this one, and Dyatlov himself said it might be a bit longer. But once several days had passed, the families of the group began to worry and contacted the university as well as the local bureau of the Communist Party, until on February 20th, a search was launched. 5 days later, student volunteers from UPI found ski tracks, and the next day they found a tent on a remote mountain that Soviet officials designate as Height 1079, one that the Mansi, the indigenous populace of the area, call Kholat Sakhel, or Dead Mountain. The tent was partially collapsed and buried in the snow, but once it was dug out, the search party saw that it had been deliberately slashed in multiple places. Inside, everything was neat and orderly, with the skiers' boots, axes, laid-out food, wood for warmth, clothes, cameras, journals, but none of the skiers. About 100 feet downhill, footprints from 8 or 9 people were found walking towards the tree line. Some of the footprints were of stockinged feet, and others that seemed that they were bare, with one set seeming to be for a person wearing a single ski boot. The trail was followed for 600 yards until they vanished in the tree line. The search party convened for the night, but the following morning, they found the first members of the group. Under a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest, the bodies of Krivnichenko and Doroshenko were found in nothing but their underwear, lying next to a dead fire. Above them, roughly 12 to 15 feet up the tree, were recently broken branches, while on the trunk, bits of skin and torn clothes were found, as if the two had tried desperately to climb up into the tree. On February 27th, the bodies of Dyatlov and Kolmogorova were found further up the slope facing the direction of the tent, with tightly clenched fists, making it seem like they were trying to get back to the tent when they collapsed. Dyatlov was roughly 1,000 feet from the cedar tree, while Kolmogorova was over 2,000 feet from it. The 4 bodies were sent to be autopsied, while the search continued for the 5 other members of the group. And this is where the oddities really began to pop up. The state of their bodies and the wounds were bizarre, to say the least. Krivnoshchenko had blackened fingers and third-degree burns on one of his shins and foot, and a chunk of flesh was missing from his right hand, which was later found inside of his mouth. Doroshenko had burnt hair on one side of his head and a charred sock, while all of the bodies were covered in bruises, abrasions, and cuts. A few days after the discovery of the 4 members, on March 5th, a 5th body was discovered. Slobodin, who was also found on the slope that led back to the tent, who had a sock on one foot and a felt booty on the other. His autopsy noted the bruises and abrasions, along with a minor fracture to his skull. At this point, a homicide investigation was underway, led by Lev Ivanov. The evidence that had been discovered was gathered up for forensic analysis, and the tent with its contents were helicoptered out from the mountains and set up inside a police station. It was here that a seamstress who had come to the station for a uniform fitting noticed the slash marks and informed the investigators that those slashes in the tent, they had been done from the inside. In early May, the snow began to melt when a Mansi hunter and his dog came across the remains of a makeshift snow den 250 feet from the tree that Krivnoshchenko and Doroshenko were found under. Inside was a floor of branches with pieces of tattered clothing lying about, including black cotton sweatpants with the right leg cut off and the left half of a woman's sweater. A search team was brought in, and using an avalanche probe, a piece of flesh was uncovered. As they dug around the den, they eventually found the last 4 members of the group: Thibaut Brignoles, Kolivatov, Zolotaryov, and Dubinina, lying together in a rocky stream bed under 10 feet of snow. The injuries to 3 of them were brutal. Thibaut Brignoles' skull was fractured so severely that pieces of bone had been driven into his brain. Zolotaryov and Dubinina both had crushed chests with multiple broken ribs, and the autopsy report noted a massive hemorrhage in the right ventricle of Dubinina's heart. The medical examiner said the damage was similar to what is typically seen as the result of an impact of an automobile moving at high speed. Yet none of the bodies had external penetrating wounds, though Zolotaryov was missing his eyes, and Dubinina was missing her eyes, tongue, and part of her upper lip. Her stomach contained about 100 grams of dark brown mucosal mass, suggesting that she was still alive when her tongue was removed. A careful inventory of clothing was recovered from the bodies, revealing that some of these victims were wearing clothes taken or cut off the bodies of others, and a laboratory found that several items emitted unnaturally high levels of radiation. A radiological expert testified that, because the bodies had been exposed to running water for months, these levels of radiation must originally have been many times greater. On May 28th, the homicide case was closed, with Lev Ivanov advising that his role was to determine whether a crime had been committed, not to clarify what had happened. Once it was decided that homicide was not what killed the hikers, he ended his report with, "It should be concluded that the cause of the hikers' demise was an overwhelming force which they were not able to overcome." The result of the tragedy was that a number of officials who had nothing to really do with the events were punished or fired, including the director of UPI and the chairman of its sports club, the local Communist Party secretary, the chairman of 2 workers' unions, and a union inspector. Why? Because for Soviet Russia, someone had to be punished even if they had nothing to do with it. The investigative files, photographs, and journals were classified, and the area around Dead Mountain was placed off limits to skiers and outdoor enthusiasts for years. Needless to say, the families of the victims were left deeply dissatisfied with this sudden conclusion, and wrote to officials demanding a more thorough investigation. But nothing more was done, and the case fell into relative obscurity. Since then, there have been many theories of what had happened to the 9 hikers, including one from Lev Ivanov himself. In 1990, Lev Ivanov, who at this point was retired, published an article where he claimed that he was pressured to not include his thoughts on what had happened to the group. The article, titled "The Enigma of the Fireballs," said that the hikers had been killed by heat rays or balls of fire, commonly associated with UFOs. Ivanov described his examination of the scene with trees having unusual burn marks which, quote, confirmed that some kind of heat ray or a powerful force, whose nature is completely unknown to us at least, acted selectively on specific objects, in this case, people. The last photograph in Krivnichenko's camera showed flares and streaks of light against a black background, which helped boost this theory. Though I've never heard of UFOs or aliens being so aggressive before. If it had been aliens, then why did they leave the bodies of the hikers strewn about? And why would Krivnichenko and Doroshenko decide that a tree out in the open with a fire under it would be their best bet at safety? As we go through these theories, you're going to realize that all of them have really major holes in them. And that's why this is literally Russia's greatest mystery. Well, at least greatest public mystery. Another theory that is generally more accepted is that the skiers had stumbled into a secret weapons testing ground. The belief is that a missile or nuclear weapon launch went wrong and severely injured some of the skiers, forcing the group to flee the tent in a panic, where they froze to death or were killed by military observers. Yuri Yudin falls into this camp, where before his death in 2013, he stated that he believed his friends were taken from the tent at gunpoint and murdered, with Dubinina having her tongue cut out because she was the most outspoken in the group. This wouldn't really explain why the tent was cut up from the inside, though, or why the cedar tree had cloth, bits of flesh, and broken branches, or why the bodies were positioned the way they were. Those who support the weapons test theory cite claims from people of that region who had seen flashes of light or fireballs in the direction of the mountain. It could also explain Krivnichenko's photo of being man-made weapons rather than aliens. Remember, humans are incredibly violent and love finding new, innovative ways to kill each other. Sometimes our brutality, creativity, and determination surpasses what the majority expects from us. But I mean, look, right now the UK has laser beams for weapons. It's called Dragonfire. It's absolutely nuts. Sci-fi ain't sci-fi no more, guys. We're literally in the year 3000 when it comes to our weaponry, and the year 600 when it comes to common fucking human decency. Put your fucking card away. We got laser beam weapons, and people still leave their cards out, and we have 40-hour work weeks while AI writes our books and makes our art. God, we're ass backwards. Sorry, got lost in the rage there for a second. Moving on. In 2008, a 3-foot-long piece of metal was found in the area believed to be part of a Soviet ballistic missile. Secret weapon testing would explain why during the investigation, Ivanov's superior, Yevgeny Okashev, was instructed to have the recovered items tested for radiation. And radiation was indeed found on some of the clothes of Yuri Krivnichenko. To be fair, he had once worked at Chelyabinsk 40, a secret nuclear facility that caused the second worst nuclear incident by radioactivity being released. Well, or third, actually, because Fukushima. It was called the Kishtim disaster, and it occurred 2 years before the Dyatlov Pass incident. Yuri was among the people sent in to clean it up, but the amount of radiation that was on his clothes would not have been nearly as high, even if they were somehow the same clothes he had worn during the cleanup. Similarly to why Yudin's theory doesn't fully work, the weapons testing theory doesn't hold up too well when you start to look at the evidence. The snow was undisturbed when the search parties went looking for the hikers, except for the trail leading to the tree line. If it was a weapon failure or a weapon in general, then why wasn't the snow disturbed elsewhere? Oddly dipped where it might have melted, have more footprints in the snow if military personnel went on a murdering spree. Why did they flee so oddly dressed and not take their cameras and some equipment for warmth when they ran? Why were some of the bodies so brutally damaged, like they were in a car accident, but there was nothing that showed piercings or shrapnel damage? The next theory is the KGB theory. This theory is centered around Zolotaryov, who was the last-minute addition to the group. Zolotaryov was 37 years old, much older than the others in the group, and he was also a World War II veteran. A book was published in Russia with the idea that Zolotaryov and 2 other skiers were actually KGB agents, assigned to meet with American CIA operatives to feed them misinformation. Samples of clothing covered in radioactive isotopes would be offered as bait, but the CIA agents discovered the deception and killed all of the hikers before setting up the scene as it was discovered. Now, it's possible Zolotaryov could have had KGB links. He did serve in World War II with missing information and inconsistencies, and his last-minute inclusion is rather suspicious. The idea that he was meeting with CIA operatives on top of a mountain while traveling with a group of students, though? Doubtful. I mean, it makes much more sense to meet them at a McDonald's. And once again, where would the other footprints be? Why wouldn't they just toss the bodies under some snow and make it seem like an avalanche killed them? How did they cause the intense injuries? Did they bring a car up the mountain with them and run them all over? I mean, that is rather American. Well, speaking of avalanches, that is another theory that has been proposed. That an avalanche occurred hitting the tent, causing the injuries to some of the skiers, and forcing the whole group to cut their way out of the tent and head to the forest for shelter. But there's no avalanche debris to be found. In fact, if you look at some of the evidence photos, you can see a ski pole holding up the front of the tent, and it was still standing after all the time it took for whatever happened to happen, and search teams to discover the tent. More so, the slopes were deemed too shallow to generate an avalanche, and the injuries to the 3 victims from the den, they would have been debilitating and would have needed a massive amount of support to be moved. But there is no evidence of anyone being dragged. The footprints in the snow clearly outline the group walking, not running, towards the woods. All of them. Donnie Eicher, a best-selling author and filmmaker, believes that it was perhaps the wind that did it. To elaborate, from his book Dead Mountain that covers the Dyatlov Pass incident, Eicher suggests that the tragedy was caused by a freak combination of physical phenomena from von Karman vortex streets and infrasound.
I like your funny words, Magic Man.
Infrasound is sound whose frequency is so low it can't be sensed by human hearing, basically anything below 20 hertz. While they can't be heard, they can be felt, and these sounds can cause fear and unrest in humans. It's been suggested that haunted houses and other paranormal phenomena could be the result of a natural infrasound source. So the belief is that infrasound may have caused panic in the hikers. And where did the sound come from? A von Karman vortex street. And what's that, you may be wondering?
No shit, Sherlock.
I'm going to do my best to try to explain it, but I'm not a scientist. I have a degree in art, so take that as you will. I kind of wish I had Bill Nye the Science Guy here so that he could do a better job of explaining it. But anyway, when a fluid such as water or air passes slowly around an obstacle, that fluid passing closest to the surface experiences frictional drag and slows down. When the flow passes a critical rate, the drag becomes significant, and the slower region around the object results in a pair of circulating regions or vortices in the shadow. At even higher flow rates, the vortices can get pushed away from the obstacle and continue to circulate as they flow downstream. The pair alternate in detachment, and the result is a line of vortices flowing away from the obstacle, namely the von Karman vortex street. These streets appear in both liquids and in the atmosphere, and can be formed by air currents flowing around a mountain. The hikers camped on the slopes of a round mountain peak. Eicher suggests that weather conditions were perfect on that day to produce von Karman vortex tornadoes that would have produced a terrifying roar. This noise, combined with the unsettling effects of infrasound, caused the group to panic and flee into the snow. While this theory uses science and could potentially explain why the party ran off and cut the tent up from the inside, why wouldn't they just walk out the tent opening? Also, if they were panicking, why did they walk to the forest instead of running? How did their injuries occur? What happened to make some of them have fractures and all these bruises and missing eyeballs and tongues? It's a good theory, but it doesn't elaborate on what happened after that. Because hypothermia is not going to remove your tongue. It's going to freeze it, but it ain't going to remove it on you. There's one theory from a prosecutor in Yekaterinburg, Andrei Kurikov, who was put in charge of reopening the case after the Russian government had been under pressure for decades from the families of the victims and the Dyatlov Group Memorial Foundation. His theory is, well, pretty well put together, and probably the one that I tend to lean the most towards believing. It states that a snow slab had detached from the above mountain peak that they had set up their camp under to get some shelter from the high winds. This snow slab buried most of the tent and pinned down some of the occupants, possibly causing injuries. Fearing an avalanche was imminent, the 9 skiers retreated downhill, cutting open the side of the tent and taking shelter under the cedar tree to build a fire. For this theory, the positioning of the tent is incredibly important. The 1959 photos had many researchers believe the tent was pitched on a slope of roughly 15 degrees. But Kuryakov brought in topographical experts who believed it was actually closer to 23 degrees, which would be enough for an avalanche. The belief is that with this new angle and the structure of the snow with high winds, it explains why the snow slab didn't fall immediately, but hours later, with additional snow being added on top of it during the snowstorm that night. And evidence of a snow slab falling would be gone before the search parties had discovered the group. It would also explain why that ski pole was still standing upright. It just wasn't hit by the slab. He goes on to say that because the younger trees nearby the cedar tree were icy and wet, someone had to climb the cedar tree to break the branches higher up, which is why there's skin and scraps of cloth that was found on the trunk. The fire they built in these extreme conditions just wasn't enough to save them, though. The 2 most poorly dressed of the group died first. The burned skin on their bodies came from their desperate efforts to seek warmth from the fire. This would suggest that the piece of flesh Krivnichenko bit from his finger was probably the result of the delirium that overtakes someone who's dying of hypothermia, or perhaps from an attempt to test for sensation in a frostbitten hand. The surviving skiers cut the clothes off their dead comrades and dressed themselves in the remnants. At some point, the group split up. 3 skiers, including Dyatlov, tried to return to the tent and soon froze to death as they struggled uphill. The other 4, who were better dressed, decided to build a snow den to shelter in overnight. They needed deep snow, which they found in a ravine a couple hundred feet away. Unfortunately, the spot they picked lay above a stream, a tributary of the Losva River. The stream, which never freezes, had hollowed out a deep, icy tunnel, and the group's digging caused its roof to collapse, throwing them onto the rocky stream bed and burying them in 10 to 15 feet of snow. The pressure of tons of snow forcing them against the rocks caused the traumatic injuries found in the group. The facial damage, missing tongue, eyes, and lip, probably resulted from scavenging by small animals, combined with decomposition. A thorough theory, but I can't help but wonder, why would the group have split up? Why would Dyatlov and the others have tried to go back to a buried tent? Even if they wanted to get supplies, why didn't they try to get them when they were still by the tent? Kuryakov's theory resulted in him receiving scorn from the family members of the victims and the Dyatlov Group Memorial Foundation. A month after giving his press conference of what he believed happened, he was removed from his post, though his office claims he resigned. The final theory? A Yeti did it. In Thibault Brignol's camera, the final photograph shows a dark figure in the snowy forest. This was enough for the Discovery Channel to make an entire show around it called Russian Yeti, The Killer Lives. No, a Yeti did not kill them. I won't even entertain this theory, as it is an insult to the victims in my opinion, and this is coming from a cryptid enthusiast. There was nothing but a blurry photo to suggest this. And if you really want to hear why I think a Yeti didn't do it, simply re-listen to my previous explanation of footprint evidence. I love cryptids, but I'm not going to sit here and think that a Yeti took out 9 campers. We may never know exactly what happened to the group of hikers. Since their deaths, Dyatlov Pass has become a popular hiking and tourist destination, with many making the journey that the hikers had gone on to see where the tent had once stood, where the cedar tree still stands, and the stream bed still lies. Many go to test their own theories, getting measurements and photos, while others go just for the experience. One thing that they almost all follow is the rule that their group doesn't consist of 9 people. Even if it's just a superstition, why take any chance after all? But what do you think? What do you believe happened to the hikers? Do you think it was a Russian secret experiment? KGB shenanigans? Aliens? A Yeti? Let me know in the comments. I read them all for future video ideas and to see how many other people enjoy learning about spooky stuff like myself. If you want to see what I release in the future, consider subscribing, liking this video, clicking the bell, and sharing it with others. If you'd like to support me in other ways, consider checking out my Patreon. Speaking of patrons, I'd like to give a big thank you to mine, especially my VIP camper, Lex Prelius. You can also join my Discord server where we've been having lovely conversations about Coots and his basement home. Maybe it's time for some redecorating down there. The cobwebs are becoming a real nuisance. We'll see. Well, with that, I'm Allie, this is Wicked Encounters, and I'll see you next time. Bye!